One more way we could go about keeping from polluting the global namescape, and that it was a little more involved than the others. So what we could do is put all of this inside an object and make all of our functions methods on the object. So if you know any other object-oriented programming languages, you're familiar with methods. Methods are simply functions on an object. In JavaScript, anytime you see dot some function, you're calling a method. And as you might guess, those are really just other properties of the object, so you could use the square bracket notation to get it to instead of the dot. Now you still need those parentheses on the outside. But we can totally just assign functions to object properties. And that's more or less what we're going to do. So in order to do this, we do unfortunately need to create one global variable. But that's okay. We can live with one. So let's make const app equals, and then we'll just use the block we already have. Now you can't just go declaring consts inside an object literal. We need to do that property name : value thing. So instead of const person form equals this, we need just person form : that with a comma at the end. By the way, did we talk about semicolons in here yesterday? We did in the morning, but I think I might have skipped over that. Okay, so you may have noticed I haven't been using them. I'm not going to start either, just to save you some suspense. But I used to use them all the time. So they are optional in JavaScript and always have been. A new line is also a way to end a statement. Because JavaScript has something built in called ASI, automatic semicolon insertion. So it literally goes in and adds the semicolons if you don't. But that means it adds them wherever it wants. Now there's no way to turn that off, so it's going to add them where they think they belong, whether you do or not. But sometimes it will put them where you don't expect. Frankly, that's really unusual. There are a few things to look out for, but you're pretty unlikely to ever actually do any of those things. So the main reason people used to use them all the time and stopped is because oftentimes when you actually put JavaScript into production, you'll minify it. In other words, run it through some sort of preprocessor that makes the code as small as possible. It'll get rid of all the extra white space. It'll make your variable names as short as possible automatically. And historically, those kind of ruined everything if you didn't use semicolons, because it wouldn't do automatic semicolon insertion before it did that. But the modern tools do. So you can still leave them out. It'll run automatic semicolon insertion before it minifies it, and you'll be okay. So since we're using ES6 and other modern stuff, we don't have to worry about it. All of the React tools that we're going to be using do a good job of minifying without ruining stuff. So we're not going to use semicolons. So render color colon this anonymous function, this arrow function. Render item colon this arrow function. Aha, I'm starting to get some little squigglies. You know why? I forgot the comma. Since this is an object, literal, you need property name, value, comma, before the next key value. Very good. Render list, colon, arrow function, handle submit, colon, arrow function, comma. person forward add event listener. This isn't something I can just assign to something. This is an actual function call that we need to do. So this needs to go inside some function. So how about we create a function, and I'm going to leave that trailing comma there. Let's add one right at the top called init. And it's going to call person form add event listener. And that's actually the only reason we even have this person form variable. So instead of making it an object property, we're just going to make it a local variable inside init. Const person form equals document query selector form. Don't forget our comma. Groovy. Well, we've done it. Nothing's going to work still. It will try to run that, but it's not going to do right. Let's see what does happen. Well, first of all, I actually need to actually run init, right? So I don't know if you've thought about this, but that's actually the only code that runs when we load this thing. It just creates that person form variable and adds the event listener. All these other functions don't get called until after the event fires, right? So on page load, we just need to create app and call app.init. And that's all we need to do. Now, if we really didn't want to create a global variable, we could, even for app, we could still wrap that whole thing in a block. I'm not going to bother, but we could. It's kind of handy having it, though, because then we could still get to app in the console. So what's going to happen if we try to run this rascal? Uncaught reference error right off the bat. Handle submit is not defined at object init on line 4. Notice these error messages are pretty good. So index.js line 46 is where it called init. And then init on line 4 made a reference to handle submit, which is not defined. Why? Because this is no longer just handle submit. This is app.handle submit, right? But I don't want to have to call app explicitly from inside itself. I really wish I could just reference the current object, because it's a method on the same darn object I'm already in. Wouldn't it be cool if there were a way to do that? How do you think I might do that? Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could do that by using a little variable we learned about yesterday? This. Let's try it. This.handle submit. Now handle submit's still going to try to do a bunch of stuff we don't want it to do, so I'm going to comment out most of it. Highlight, command / or control / on Windows. Alert. Hooray. Okay, didn't get the error right off the bat. It at least did bind it to something. Whackety schmackety. Aw, cuss. It refreshed the page. That meant we didn't prevent default, which means we did not call the right function. What gives? Let's throw a debugger in here. That way we'll get a breakpoint when it runs init. Okay, there that is. Look at our local variables. Person form undefined, hasn't happened yet till line 5. But look, this looks like this object that has handle submit and stuff. It's lying to us. So here is a difference between arrow functions and other functions. Most of the time this helps us. It makes things easier. In this one case, it actually makes things slightly worse. So we learned that inside a new function, by default, this is the global object. Or maybe we didn't talk about that. It's window. Unless it's something else. So inside an event handler, it's the object that the event fired upon, right? In a method, if the method was called by dot name of method parentheses, it is usually bound to the containing object. But what the arrow function does is it makes sure that inside that arrow function, this is bound to the same thing that it was outside that function. Which in this case, since there is no enclosing function, it's just this app object, it's window. So an arrow function is actually counterproductive in this case. So let's change these. So we could say init function. They can still be anonymous functions. We can still do that. ES6 does provide a shorthand for this, though. If it's an object property, you can just say init like that. Same thing as using a regular function expression. So let's change all these. Get rid of our arrows. All right, now this .handle submit should hopefully be the right thing. I took my debugger out too. I don't know if you saw that. I refreshed. Let's try again. Hooray. It worked. It is bound to the right thing. So we can try doing more. Okay, it shouldn't be a problem running the next line or the next line. Now we're trying to call render list. It needs to be this.render list. Details of pin child, that's fine. So let's go to render list. Now we're calling render color. That should now be this.render color. And this.render item. Okay, that's about it. Refresh, try again. Let's fill out everything. This.render list is not a function, and handle submit line 41. Oh, it isn't, you say. Why is that? So here are the rules we discussed for how this gets assigned. Most of the time, it's just window. When you call a method, and by the way, it doesn't matter that it was defined as a method. What matters is you called it as a method with dot. This is assigned to the containing object. How did handle submit get called? Well, init called init. Init, then nowhere in init did we say this.handle submit open close parens. We made a reference to it in adding an event listener. But what is this inside an event handler? It's the thing that the event fired upon. So that's the other thing we learned. This, if you don't know otherwise, it's window. If it's a method, it's the object that the method was called on. If it's an event handler, it's the object on which the event was fired. In other words, the same thing as event.target. Well, shucks, what do we do now? There are a few different ways of dealing with this. There's a way that I kind of wish I had shown the morning class, but I didn't. But this always happens when there's a morning and afternoon. The afternoon always gets a slightly better class. Don't tell. But I will cover this in the morning then, since I didn't. So you can force the value of this. We could say bind and just pass in this. So what bind does is bind the value of this to something specific. Now, I could have passed in anything there, but the point is I want it to be what this is right now. So if I pass this into bind, then handle submit is going to be bound to the same darn thing. So let's try it. Another reason, by the way, to use event target instead of this down in the event handler, so that you can bind it to something else if you need to, because a lot of frameworks do. Whackety smackety. Yep, it works now. So, not a bad way to do it. By the way I showed them was instead of passing handle submit as the event listener, let's pass in an anonymous function that will still receive the event. And that arrow function is going to call handle submit and make sure that we pass the event in. So now our event handler is this arrow function, which is going to call handle submit. And because handle submit is no longer being called as an event listener or as an event handler, but rather being invoked as a method with open close parens, the binding of this is what we want it to be. Now, how come I was able to use this inside here? Because remember, this is an arrow function. This is a whole new function. But that's the magic of arrow functions. Arrow functions automatically bind this to the same value as the enclosing function. So that's why existing JavaScript developers were so darn happy to see these things, because we use this several places. We have our map, wherever that is. Yeah, map. And inside the map, we were able to say this.renderColor and this.renderItem. In the old days, we would not have been able to do that. We would have had to explicitly bind that inner function, or we would have had to do something goofy like create a new variable called self and set it to the current value of this. And then we could have used self in here, even though this had changed. If that's overloading your brain, forget I ever said it, because we don't have to do that anymore. We have arrow functions. So as long as I haven't screwed this up in demonstrating things. Nope, seems okay. I'm going to go ahead and commit this. Wrap everything in an object with methods. Very good. But say, why was I able to use list inside this arrow function? I use it right here. I was able to do that because that's a whole new function. Functions in JavaScript are something known as closures, also called lambdas in other languages. And the general computer science term is more often called lambdas than anything else. But we tend to call them closures in JavaScript because it's an accurate word. What that means is that a function also encloses the local scope of its containing function. So if I have a function within a function, the inner function still has access to the local variables in the containing function, which is very handy. So I can still get to list out here, even though I can't get to value. I mean, I can still get to list in, but value, which was declared inside this function, I cannot get to. I cannot get to once the inner function ends. I couldn't get to it here. Value will be gone. Now, because